Okay, I'm Sable, and this is my talk on Queen Cleopatra, not Queen of Denial, but Queen of the Nile. So Cleopatra is really one of the most fascinating women in history. I'm going to try to tell a slightly different story of her affairs with Mark Antony and Julius Caesar, which are very famous and actually really happened, and try to sort of tell a little bit more of what might have really been going on.
Yeah,
so she was born in 69 BC in Alexandria. She was Pharaoh, born to the Pharaoh, and her father was Ptolemy. They were descended from Greeks, from Alexander the Great's generals 300 years before. Alexander had conquered Egypt and then left behind his general Ptolemy to run the country when he went off to conquer more of the world, and he died in the middle of his battles. He never came back to Egypt. So Ptolemy was the pharaoh, and his dynasty reigned for 300 years. So Cleopatra wasn't even Egyptian. She was mostly Greek, descended from and they intermarried with their brothers and their fathers and children, and also the Ptolemies were all famous for trying to kill each other to try to get power. They'd done that for 300 years, and very inbred. So she was born in 69 BC, and she had several brothers and a sister. And her father was killed in 58 BC, and she and her brother, because Rome was in the middle of a civil war. Julius Caesar was fighting with another general to control the Roman Empire. So they were fighting. It was a civil war. And the other Roman general was killed by Cleopatra's brother. So instead of being grateful, Julius Caesar was very angry, and he was in Egypt at that time. But he got there a little bit ahead of his army, so he didn't have a lot of reinforcements. So Cleopatra and her brother had a civil war also, because neither one of them wanted the other one to be alive and rule either. So they were fighting, and Cleopatra's brother killed the other Roman general that was fighting with Julius Caesar. But then Julius Caesar was angry that he killed him instead of being grateful. So Julius Caesar hid in the palace because her brother had a whole army out there, and Julius Caesar didn't have a lot of troops at that time. They were on their way, but they weren't there yet. So he was sort of frightened for his life too. And Cleopatra was far away from the city because her brother was trying to kill her. So the famous story of her being smuggled in on a carpet, which was probably a laundry sack, probably not even a carpet. One of her slaves got a laundry sack and wrapped her in it and went into Caesar's palace, or it was her palace where Caesar was, because if her brother had found her, he would have killed her. So she snuck in there and was all dressed in her finery. And Julius Caesar, she was 18 years old, and Julius Caesar was 52. He had a huge history of womanizing. He was bisexual. He slept with men, women. They said Caesar was every woman's husband and every man's wife. That was like gossip about Julius Caesar. And he slept with kings and whoever he wanted to. And she was a young woman, and Caesar also liked surprises when he was planning battles. That's why he was there early. It was like a surprise. So in his tactics, he used surprise. And when she got herself smuggled into the palace, and he opened up the rug, and there she was, I think he was really delighted by that, because she was a strategist just as smart as he was. And that's really the story of these love affairs. I don't know that Cleopatra really loved either one of these men, but she was fighting for her country and her life. She was using all the weapons at her command. She actually, and they don't really point this out in the history books, was the richest person in the world at that time, far richer than Rome. Rome was broke because they were fighting all these battles and trying to have all this empire, but they were overextended. So they were kind of looking for a source of money, and she had lots of money and she had troops. So when she smuggled herself in that laundry sack to Caesar, and she was a young woman, and she wasn't very pretty. I've got a picture of her, which I'll show you later. There are coins minted during her realm with her approval that show her with a big hook nose, and she isn't very pretty at all. But she was brilliant. She knew 12 languages. She was the only Macedonian Greek pharaoh that knew Egyptian. They didn't even bother to learn the language of the people country they were running. But she knew 12 languages, and she got in there to Caesar, and she said, you know, if you'll let me rule instead of my brother, I'll let you have all my money, I'll finance your wars. Egypt also had a ton of grain, which was the backbone of the Roman diet, and their empire needed grain, and she had lots of it, and there was very little grain in Rome. They couldn't really grow too much there, so they really needed it. So it wasn't just lust, although I'm sure that was there. She was enormously good at flattery and manipulation, and she was very smart and very shrewd and a strategist. So she captivated Julius Caesar. Her brother, when he found out, was furious that she was in there and he was out on the outs. And they stayed holed up in the palace for 6 months. And the brother was outside with all his troops. And then after 6 months, she was pregnant. So she always claimed the boy, and it was a boy. So she always claimed it was Julius Caesar's child. He never acknowledged the child because it was illegal in Rome to have a wife that was a foreigner. So she couldn't, and he had a wife back home who he cheated on all the time. But he couldn't acknowledge the boy as his son, but she did, and she called him Caesarion and expected him to be the next emperor of Rome. So after 6 months, she was pregnant, and Caesar got her brother back and wanted them to rule Egypt together. You know, he didn't want a civil war in Egypt. He wanted peace so they could just conquer the country and not have any problems. So he got them to rule together for a while, and then he had been long delayed getting back to Rome. The Roman Senate, who started to hate Cleopatra, they thought she was too extravagant. You know, Rome they did extravagance in Rome, but they frowned on certain kinds of extravagance, and she was very wild and extravagant. And all their women in Rome were supposed to be subservient to the men and not talk back, and certainly not have power. And she was very different. She was independent, and I think that's why history has not been kind to her, because she was an independent woman in an era when women were supposed to be subservient. Had the man done the things she's done, and they did too. He and Mark Antony slept around all the time for whatever reasons, but because she was a woman and independent, history was very harsh with her. And so Caesar had been away from Rome too long. The Roman Senate said, you know, you're sleeping with your whore up there, you know, this woman has bewitched you and made you lose your mind, you're giving her too many concessions, and you got to come back to Rome, you know, because, you know, you're not doing your job. So finally he went back to Rome. She had the baby. It was a boy. Caesar had no other children. His wives never, you know, were able to give him, and he didn't have an heir. So she went back to Rome with him for a while. And while she was there, and he installed her in a palace as his mistress, and while she was there, her astronomers gave him the calendar of 365 days that we use today. She was very educated in math and astronomy and science, and she influenced, and they had a library at Alexandria, which was one of the wonders of the ancient world, with scrolls from For hundreds of years, the Ptolemies had everything that went through their empire. They got a copy of the scrolls and they put them in the library. It had, I think I read 300,000 manuscripts on papyrus and, paper, and it was a wonderful, it was a center of learning, a cosmopolitan city, Alexandria, that people liked to party. There was every nationality in the world there. They all got along. It was way more sophisticated than Rome, which was sort of they were a lot of barbarians, a lot of them in Rome, but in Egyptian they had science and art, and they were very hedonistic. I will describe later the kind of feast they had, but in Egypt, when they had a feast, they had a feast like you wouldn't even have today, because it would be, it's like so extravagant, worse than the Oscars and everything else. just total extravagance. And so he went back to Rome, and Caesar was getting very egotistical now, and he wanted more and more power, to be a dictator. He started calling himself a god, and that angered the Roman Senate, because even in Egypt, she was considered a god. And I think she corrupted him while he was there, because he wanted to be considered a god in Rome, but the Romans were dead set against it. A person was never a god in the Roman Empire at that time. So he was really getting too big for his britches, which is why they assassinated him. And she was in Rome when they did assassinate him, but she was able to flee the country and go back to Egypt, which was an arduous journey at that time by boat and land. And she made it back to Egypt. And he was assassinated. In his will, he had named Octavius as his successor, which was a nephew, I believe, of his. Not Mark Antony, who was one of his favorite generals and a loyal supporter of him. And Mark Antony was not in on killing Caesar. He was his friend, and he was not one of those who stabbed him. So after Caesar was killed, there was a big outcry, we've got to punish these people. And so Cleopatra was in Egypt, back in Egypt. Her brother had been killed, and the only person standing in her line for the throne was her sister, who was a prisoner in Rome, because that was the only of her siblings left. Caesar had killed all her other siblings. So she was ruling the country with her son, Caesar's son, as co-regent. And so, because Caesar had at her bequest, killed all the rest of her relatives, so there was nobody except her sister. So Mark Antony and Octavius were the two big generals in Rome that were left. Octavius was Caesar's nephew, and he was pretty much of a weakling. But he was back in Rome, and Mark Antony was out in the fields conquering different areas. He had the eastern part of the empire. Octavian had the west. And then relations grew very strained between Octavius and Antony. And Antony wanted to find out what Cleopatra's role was in the assassination of Caesar, because he wanted to know. He'd met her when she was a child, but he hadn't seen her since. So here we have the famous story of how he meets Cleopatra as an adult. And I wanted to say about Caesar and Cleopatra, and this is true of Antony too. Again, Cleopatra had enormous wealth, way more than either one of them did, and Rome needed her wealth, her troops, and her goodwill. And she, in return, wanted to keep her throne. So it really wasn't all love, as they say in the movies. There was a lot of political maneuvering going on both sides. And so Antony was very handsome. He was supposed to look like Hercules. Very handsome, muscular guy, a real warrior. His men loved him. He had a very coarse sense of humor and not too bright, probably. He was a raving alcoholic. Just like Richard Burton. He was a womanizer. He had 3 wives back in Rome. I don't know if he divorced them or whatever, but he had a wife back in Rome. But they left their wives home, and then they went all over the world sleeping around with whoever they wanted. So, it wasn't his first rodeo either. He was 42, Cleopatra was 27. And he summoned Cleopatra because he wanted to know her role in the assassination, and she ignored his summons 3 or 4 times. She was making him beg for it. But she knew that he was her best shot at keeping her throne. And she had to decide who she was going to back, Octavius or Anthony. And she wanted her son named as Caesar instead of Octavius. So she sided with Anthony, but she made him wait. She's trying to, torture him and drive him crazy. And she finally answers his summons. And here we have the very famous scene, which was true, of her on the barge going to meet Anthony. And I have some notes on the barge. So she goes up the Nile with her purple sails, her golden boat with silver oars, and she was a god. In Egypt, she was a god. And she was dressed as Isis and Aphrodite. Her handmaidens were dressed as, Venus and Aphrodite. She's in this barge going up the river with perfume and flowers. And she's setting up gigantic feasts, with 8 pigs, full, pigs are like this big, and they roast them. And they make these feasts. So she was heading up the barge, and they had lutes and cymbals and all their music. And she's heading up the barge, and Anthony's busy signing papers or doing something, he's supposed to do. And everybody deserted Anthony to go look and see Cleopatra coming up the bar, the river. And finally he comes out to see what's going on, and there she is. And surprise, here I am. And she said, and he had a fantasy that he was Dionysus, who was the god of wine, which was very appropriate for him because he's an alcoholic. And she says, she had a famous quote that says, no, I can't find it now. Well, anyway. So she said, I am Isis come to join with Dionysus. So she was an expert at flattery. She had a beautiful voice. When you see her coins, she wasn't pretty, but she had a beautiful voice, and she knew just how to manipulate people and flatter people. And so she comes up the barge and she meets him, and he says, oh, let me give you a feast to welcome you. She said, no, I've got a feast ready for you. Let me go first. So that was her way of assuming control right there. So then she does this feast. And she had so much money. She has more money than the 1%ers in the world today. So they would have feasts with couches. They would have golden goblets rimmed with jewels. And, 8 pigs and birds. Inside the pigs would be more birds. And, just the most extravagant feast. Wine. They did binge drinking, she and Anthony. They would drink for days, just binging. And they would have 8 different rooms of feasting with all the people. And then when the guests went home, sure, take the gold goblet with all the jewels on it, take the couches, take the food. There was just luxury. And that was very corrupting to Anthony because he was kind of weak-minded. They weren't like that much in Rome, that much. And he was just completely smitten with her. And he had a coarse sense of humor. She joined right in the coarseness because she was, trying to be seduce him. So they did the feasting, and, he slept with her, and she actually ended up bearing him 3 children, 2 twins, and 1 more child. And and he was there a long time in Alexandria. He was supposed to go back to Rome. The Roman Senate got really mad at him because he's not doing a job of conquering people, and he was sitting there partying under the bewitchment. They thought she was a witch and had bewitched him. And he was getting concessions from her. She was getting concessions from him about having her run territories. He wanted her son to be Caesar instead of Octavius. really went over very badly in Rome, and Rome really turned against him, and Octavius was completely, manipulating things in Rome to go against Anthony. So, and he was there, and Anthony was far away. So they would have these parties. They would play games of chance. They had a club they called the Inimitable Livers. Just party, party, party. They would go out on the streets of Alexandria at night in disguise and play tricks on people, and she was with him all the time. She wouldn't leave him alone. He would try to work, and she'd come and visit him and distract him. She was just like, completely trying to control him. And so he was getting in a lot of trouble in Rome. And so Octavian, in an attempt to control Anthony, brought Anthony back to Rome and made him marry Octavia's sister, Octavia. And he kind of forced him to do it. So he was married to the enemy's sister, and then he goes back to Cleopatra, and it wasn't too good. That really pissed everybody off too. So toward the end now, he's back with Cleopatra. He's not doing his job conquering the world. He's partying with her. He's thinking of himself as a god, which again was just really bothered the Roman sensibility. That was, overweening megalomania. They just wouldn't tolerate it. So he and Octavian started fighting, and the battles went on, and Cleopatra was aiding Anthony with troops and getting, stuff like that. But what happened was, the short version is that Anthony lost, and Octavian's troops won the battles. So Anthony and Cleopatra are right now separated, and they're not that far away, but they're not in the same place. And he lost the battle, and it was his duty to commit suicide in an honorable death. And he stabbed himself, but it didn't kill him right away. Because Cleopatra, I forgot this, Cleopatra had sent him a note deliberately, I'm not quite sure why, that she had already committed suicide. And in despair, he tried to kill himself. But she wasn't. She was very much alive. And I think he, at that point, had become an encumbrance to her, and I think she wanted to get rid of him. Because I think she was hoping to manipulate Octavian like she'd done the other two, which wasn't that unreasonable. So Anthony's dying. He's got a stab wound in his stomach. And then he hears that Cleopatra's still alive. So he has people bring him to her palace, where she's on the second floor. And he's bleeding, and he's dying, and his hands are dripping with blood. And they raise him up to the second floor with ropes while he's dying, and they pull him into her thing where she's under house arrest. And he dies in her arms. And she's covered with blood, and she's ripping off her clothes, because in those days when someone died, people went crazy, and they scratched themselves and mutilated themselves and screamed and yelled, and it was considered normal for a few, a death. So she's doing all that, and then he dies, but she's under house arrest and she's still alive. Now, she had been researching poisons. She was very smart. She was trained in science of the time. And of course, being a very cold-blooded ruler, she was experimenting on slaves to see what the easiest poison was to kill yourself with. See if they died easily or in agony. She didn't want to suffer. So she, because she knew that was a possibility that, and right before they died, they had their drinking club, they changed the name of it to Companions in Death, because they figured that they might have to commit suicide if they lost the war. Because Octavian was going to take Cleopatra to Rome as a slave and make fun of her and drag her through the streets and humiliate her, which is something she really didn't want. She'd rather die than do that, and I would too. So here she is. She's under house arrest. Mark Antony is dead. And but Octavian doesn't want her to kill herself, so he takes away all the knives, so she can't stab herself. and she's got 2 servants in there, women servants. And he's a little bit far away, and then they bring her a basket of figs. Now, the story goes that there was a snake in the figs, an asp, but probably they said she probably wouldn't have wanted to rely on an animal because it wasn't certain enough. So most likely she had poison ready, and she gave herself poison rather than a snake. And she poisons herself and her 2 servants. They dress her in all her robes of state and all her beautiful outfits. And Octavia runs and tries to save her, but it's too late. So she died, and shortly thereafter, and he buried her with Mark Antony in a mausoleum in ancient Alexandria, which has never been found because 500 years later there was a big earthquake and Alexandria fell into the ocean, and her tomb was lost, and it's never been found. And Octavia shortly thereafter killed her son by Julius Caesar because he didn't want any other claimants to the throne coming up to bug him later. And that was the end of Egypt's sovereign royalty. After that, it was a province of Rome and became handed around to different empires for a long time until relatively recently. I think it was even a part of the English Empire under Victoria, I think, and it didn't become a sovereign state on its own till, relatively recently. So she was the very last pharaoh of Egypt. She was a very capable ruler. There was a famine while she ruled for 30 years in a bloodthirsty situation by her wits and her smarts, and that's how she stayed in power. When all her siblings got killed, and she had Mark Antony murder her sister, so there was no other nonsense from that area. So she was a very capable ruler and very smart, and then so she was an amazing woman. And I'll pass around in here. I've marked with the bookmark. These coins are minted at the time she was alive and with her approval of what she actually looked like. And she really was quite homely. But she was a brilliant woman and a survivor. She was a survivor and had amazing legacy. In 1963, my namesake on the flyer, Liz Taylor, did a movie about Cleopatra with Richard Burton, who was the love of her life, and married him twice, and it was the most expensive movie ever made at the time. And also her costumes for that movie were $200,000. In 1963, that was a lot of money. And that's about it. I mean, it's a wonderful story. Lois is going to present some other things, and she's given us some wonderful photos. And it's an amazing story, and I'm very glad that you're here to hear about it. So thank you.
Oh, yeah. That's